Carl Gustav Jung was born in Kiesville, Switzerland on the 26th of July, 1875. His father, Paul Achilles Jung, was a pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church, and his mother, Emily Prieswerk, was a daughter of theologian Samuel Prieswerk, who taught at Basel University. Jung was the second son of the couple, their first son Paul having died shortly after childbirth, but Carl's sister Joanna Gertrude, known as Trudy, would later become Carl's personal secretary. Jung had a disturbed childhood due to his mother's depression, which would make her predictable and friendly during the daytime, but eccentric and bizarre during the evenings and night time. Indeed, Carl's mother would often isolate herself, claiming that spirits would visit her during the night, and she would also spend many months in a hospital near Basel for an unknown physical ailment. Jung later stayed with his maternal aunt due to his mother's illness, and as a child he was interested in history, archaeology and philosophy, but his childhood was also a traumatic one, as he would often have dreams which had a substantial impact on the development of his later theories. His upbringing in 19th century rural Switzerland also had an impact on his later ideas, especially the influence of spirituality, as in rural Switzerland, Christianity and superstition were largely intertwined. His first spiritual experiences were organising séances with his cousins, and he often wondered as a child why people were not more intent on discovering the purpose of life. Then, shortly before the end of his first year at school, at the age of 12, Carl was pushed to the ground by another boy so hard that for a moment he was knocked unconscious. The thought then came to him that he would not have to go to school anymore, and from then on, whenever he started off for school or began his homework, he would faint, resulting in him being kept at home for the next 6 months. Indeed, he would often faint regularly during this period, but eventually overcame it, later commenting that this incident was the exact moment that he discovered what neurosis was. Jung later described himself as having two personalities, one being a 12-year-old boy who was compliant, understood his own incompetence and was shy and timid, and interested in objective realities, the other being a seasoned professional with the wisdom of a mature man, sceptical and mistrustful, and interested in spiritual understanding. He was then educated at the University of Basel in medicine, and passed a natural sciences exam on the 17th of October 1896, and then the anatomical and psychological exam on the 2nd of November 1897. During this time he worked as a junior assistant for the microscopic anatomy at the Anatomical Institute, and was also a junior assistant for the surgical clinic of the Citizens Hospital in Basel. Whilst studying, he discovered that he had a passion for psychiatry and began looking at the psychiatric textbooks of Richard von Krafft-Ebing, not expecting too much, but then he read a sentence which immediately made his heart pound. This sentence was that psychoses were diseases of the personality. It was in this instant that he realised that psychiatry would be his calling, and he saw psychiatry as an opportunity both to study the factual and spiritual sides of life. Jung then received his medical degree in 1900, and following this he worked as a second-level physician at the psychiatric hospital in the University of Zurich, before being promoted to a first-level physician, and in 1903 Jung published his dissertation on the psychology of pathology and the so-called occult phenomena. Also in 1903, Jung married Emma von Rauschenbach, who was 7 years his junior, and daughter of a wealthy industrialist. They would have 5 children together, Agatha, Gret, Franz, Marianne and Helen, but maintained an open relationship throughout their marriage. In 1906, at the age of 30, Jung sent his studies on word association to Sigmund Freud in Vienna, and the two men then met for the first time the following year. Jung recalled their meeting as being interminable, and the two talked non-stop for 13 hours, being engrossed in each other's ideas. Indeed, Jung described his initial impressions of Freud as being extremely intelligent, shrewd and altogether remarkable, and the two men remained friends for 6 years. Then, in 1905, Freud sent a collection of his latest essays to Jung in Munich, which marked the beginning of an intense collaboration and correspondence between the two. But their friendship was not destined to last for long, as in 1912 the tension between the two had grown to such a degree that they ceased to be on friendly terms. The letters exchanged between the two men then immediately stopped, also possibly because they disagreed on the nature of libido and religion, and in 1912 their theories further diverged after Jung published The Psychology of the Unconscious and began outlining his own school of analytical psychology. Jung thought of Freud's theory of the unconscious as incomplete and unnecessarily negative, and the two then parted ways because of the disagreement over the context of the sexual involvement in the human psyche, which Freud emphasized in his works. Indeed, Carl also felt that Freud was too narrow-minded in his views on the unconscious mind and of dream interpretation. During World War I, Jung was drafted as an army doctor and became commandant of an internment camp for British soldiers and officers. Switzerland was neutral in the war and endeavoured to remain so by keeping fleeing prisoners and soldiers within its borders until the war's end, so it could not be said to be aiding either side during the conflict. Jung then began his first experiments with word association, which involved a researcher reading a list of words aloud to a subject, who was asked to respond with the first words that came into their mind. Researchers would then time the responses and note any unusual reactions such as hesitations, slips of the tongue, or unusual emotions. Indeed, Jung was interested in the patterns of responses he detected from patients, which revealed to him aspects of their unconscious feelings and beliefs. One of Carl Jung's key contributions to psychiatry is the archetype, which is the prototypical example, or the ideal example, upon which people base themselves. He would go on to outline 5 main archetypes: the self, the shadow, the anima, the animus, and the persona. The self is the regulating centre of the psyche and the facilitator of individuation, which is a process in which the unconscious becomes realised or understood. The shadow is the opposite of the ego, possessing qualities that the ego does not, but possesses nothingness. For Jung, the ego is the force in the personality responsible for feelings of identity and continuity, and contains conscious thoughts of our own behaviour, as well as feelings and memories of our experiences. Next is the anima, which is the feminine image in a man's psyche, and the animus is the masculine image in a woman's psyche. Lastly, the persona is how we present ourselves in the world, and is one of the sub-personalities, but it protects the ego from negative emotions. The ultimate aim of individual development is the self-realisation or the integration of all aspects of the psyche, or in other words, obtaining balance between them. When a person is self-realised, their persona is minimised, their anima and animus is recognised, and there is balance between extroversion and introversion. The way by which self-realisation is achieved is by transcendence, which is a function by which the conscious and unconscious come into balance and understanding. Another of Jung's important contributions is the concept of the collective unconscious. This is purported to be part of the unconscious mind, present in all species with nervous systems, and represents how structure of the psyche organises experience. It is distinct from the individual unconscious, which is a personal collection of experiences pertinent to that particular person. The collective unconscious contains archetypes and emotionally toned experiences derived from our ancestors, which affect our behaviour whenever experience simulates a biological inherited response tendency, and is also responsible for myths, legends, and religious beliefs. For Jung, the individual or personal unconscious contains repressed, forgotten, and all perceived information experienced by a particular individual during their lifetime, such as infantile memories, impulses, and complexes, which are emotionally toned groups of associated ideas. Indeed, Jung's methods of investigating the unconscious mind included dream analysis, word association tests, active imaging, psychotherapy, and painting therapy. Jung saw dreams as having a compensatory function to make up for the failing of the ego. dreams emerge from the unconscious to compensate for the non-adaptive attitude of the ego, and he also saw them as having a prospective function of being able to address situations that might occur in the future. Clients in Jungian therapy work with dreams in a number of ways. One way is to stick to the image as it appears to the dreamer, rather than to interpret it metaphorically. Another method used is that of amplification, in which the images in dreams are compared to the images from the archetypes or from myths in order to find parallels. The final way is through active imagination, in which clients engage with the dreams as if in a conversation. His first ideas were published in the Psychology of the Unconscious, which contained much of the mythological content that pointed out the parallels between mythology and the content of the unconscious mind, and the parallels between myths and psychotic fantasies. He then went on to develop his own theory called Analytic Psychology, which sees people as motivated by repressed experiences and also emotionally toned experiences coming from their ancestors. It sees people as either male or female, introvert or extrovert, rational or irrational, and experience as conscious or unconscious. It also sees motivations as being either pushed by past events, causality, or being pulled by future expectations, teleology. The two other important aspects of the theory are progression and regression. Progression involves the outward flow of psychic energy in adapting to the outside world, and regression involves the backward flow of psychic energy adapting to the inner world. He wrote for half a century on the personality, with a mythological, spiritual, and symbolic slant, and in his own personal life, he spent much of his time in self-discovery. Then, in 1921, he published Psychological Types, which is included in his analysis of personality types and the relationship between the conscious and unconscious minds. It is in this work that Jung distinguishes between introverts and extroverts, which are purported to be related to distinct psychic energies. For an extrovert, psychic energy is outwardly directed, whereas an introvert, the psychic energy is inwardly directed. For an extrovert, energy is increased when they are interacting with a large group of people, but they feel energy is decreased when they are alone, whilst conversely, when introverts are alone, their perceived energy is increased, but decreased when in a large group of people. As well as the tendencies of introversion and extroversion, there are the functions of thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting, and people can be assessed along these dimensions to give a personality type. Another contribution from Jung is the process of individuation, where an individual differentiates himself or herself from others by the development of an individual personality as distinct from the collective psychology, which is more relevant today in the Western world than ever before. Between 1914 and 1930, Jung was working on his Red Book, a 205-page manuscript that recorded his innermost thoughts and feelings. Indeed, following his feud with Sigmund Freud, Jung had what he described as a confrontation of the unconscious, in which he saw visions and heard voices, and worried that he might be menaced by psychosis. But he then decided that it was a valuable experience, and in private he induced hallucinations, or active imaginations, and recorded everything in his small journals, which he transcribed into the Red Book, which was not published or shown to the public until 2009. In his later years, Jung became Professor of Psychology at the Federal Polytechnic University of Zurich and Professor of Medical Psychology at the University of Basel in 1943. He went on various travels during his lifetime, and on his first trip outside of Europe, Jung went to Clark University in 1909 on a trip organised by G. Stanley Hall. He subsequently had various other trips to the United States, but was most deeply influenced by his trip to Taos Pueblo, a 1,000-year-old town inhabited by the Taos-speaking Native Americans. He also visited England 4 times between 1920 and 1938, visiting Oxford, Cornwall and Cheshire amongst other places, and in 1925 he embarked on his most ambitious trip to date to Bugishu in Uganda on his Biography psychological expedition. He hoped to increase his knowledge of primitive psychology by interacting with the culturally isolated peoples of the region, but found his trip to be somewhat uninspiring. Jung also undertook an extensive tour of India organised by Fowler McCormick, on which he said he found himself for the first time under the direct influence of a foreign culture. Indeed, Hindu philosophy subsequently became for him an important element in his understanding of the role of symbolism and the life of the unconscious. But during the trip, Jung became ill and was hospitalised for 2 weeks in Calcutta Hospital, with delirium resulting in him being confined to travelling within Europe from then on. Jung then treated an American alcoholic patient named Roland Hazard, who later joined the Oxford Group, which is a Christian organisation who wanted to reinvigorate Western morality. Indeed, one of the alcoholics Roland brought to the Oxford Group was Ebby Fascia, a long-time friend of Bill Wilson, who along with Dr. Bob Smith later founded Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935. Politically, Jung stressed the importance of individual rights in society, and he referred to the state as a form of slavery and thought of it as a quasi-animate personality from whom everything was expected. But this personality was only a camouflage for those individuals who knew how to manipulate it, meaning those in power. But Jung later found controversy over his political views being at times associated with anti-Semitism, but he rigorously denied this, stating in an interview with Carol Bauman in 1948, "It is clear to anyone who has read any of my books that I have never been a Nazi sympathiser. I have never been anti-Semitic, and no amount of misquotation, mistranslation, or rearrangement of what I have written can alter the record of my true point of view. Nearly every one of these passages has been tampered with, either by malice or by ignorance. Furthermore, my friendly relations with a large group of Jewish colleagues and patients over a period of many years in itself disproves any charge of anti-Semitism." Jung later, due to ill health, retired and started teaching in 1947, but would continue to publish books including The Western Consciousness and Eastern Insight, and Flying Saucers, a modern myth of the things seen in the skies, in which he sought to explain the psychological meaning of UFO sightings. His health then steadily declined until his death at the age of 85 on the 6th of June 1961 in Switzerland after a short illness. In summary, Carl Jung felt that the unconscious played a prominent role in controlling our thought processes, especially through dreaming, and believed that there were two predominant personality types, being the introvert and the extrovert. Carl Jung is seen today as one of the most important psychoanalysts of the 20th century, and very possibly of all time. Indeed, his ideas and theories are still used today amongst therapists, and much of his work can be applied to dream interpretation. He also introduced the concept of the collective unconscious to psychology, a shared compendium of human experiences, universal images and archetypes, which have influenced prominent thinkers in the modern day. You may be asking yourself why I've included a biography of the life of Carl Jung when my channel is mainly focused on historical figures. The answer to this is that if human history is about people, both their decisions and actions, then the best means we have of understanding their actions is in the study of psychology. Therefore, given Carl Jung's importance to the field of psychology, learning about his ideas can give us greater understanding of historical figures and why they did the things they did. Perhaps we should end with one of Carl Jung's most famous quotes: "Our vision becomes clear when we look inside. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens."